Next, Biography on Book TV with Melissa Mueller discussing her work, Anne Frank, the Biography. It traces the brief life of the Holocaust victim and has attracted attention for its claim to have solved a mystery surrounding the person who betrayed Anne and her family to the Nazis. Ms. Mueller's remarks took place at the Harvard Co-op bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Good evening and welcome back to the Coop, for those of you who have been here before, and welcome, period, for those of you who are here for the first time. It is reported that when Abraham Lincoln first met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, he said, so this is the little lady who made the big war. I think that if a latter-day Abraham Lincoln, by some miracle, could meet a resurrected Anne Frank, he might say something like, so this is the little girl who gave a human face to the big war. Certainly, Anne Frank's diary is the only personal, intimate document from the Second World War to have achieved the status of classic. And curiously, its reputation and its readership, as those of us who stock the book here at the Coop can attest, continues to grow all the time. But I think universality comes at a price. And the problem may be that with every passing year, it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to discern Anne the girl beneath Anne the icon, or Anne the person beneath Anne the personification. And so we have tonight's special guest, Melissa Mueller, coming to us direct from Vienna, to thank for saving Anne Frank from the rigidities of universality and revivifying the icon, so to speak, so we can appreciate Anne in the immediacy of her life and in history. Last year, Anne Frank, the Biography, which surprisingly is the only full biography of Anne Frank ever to have appeared, was published to great acclaim in hardback here in English edition. I understand it's been published in at least 4 or 5 languages, and the paperback has just arrived. And to tell us more about the background of the book and how she wrote it, we're happy to present Melissa Mueller, who will afterwards answer your questions. We'll have a general discussion. And as is our custom, those of you who would like to have a copy, either hardback or paperback, can come up and Melissa will sign it for you at the end of the session. With that, it's my great pleasure to present Melissa Mueller.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you tonight. And I'm here to give you details on how I came and why I wrote a biography on Anne Frank. Or actually, it was a long discussion within the publisher whether we should be so indecent to call it the biography, but as there was really no biography on Anne Frank before, we thought we could take the risk. Even though, as we just heard, she has not only become Hitler's most famous victim, but also one of the most famous females of the 20th century, only recently voted by Time magazine as one of the most influential heroes of our century, a patron saint of liberalism. And although her diary has not only become the most widely read book written by a Holocaust victim, but one of the most widely read books ever, sold in around 30 million copies in over 55 languages. Let me tell you what I, as a third after-war generation, coming from Austria of all places, wanted to achieve with this book. Let me give you some insight in my sources, and finally, let me try to add something to the discussion to what the girl and her diaries have to tell, or to my mind should tell, to today's world and to future generations. I was about 26 years old when, by mere chance, I picked up Anne's diary again. Actually, a friend had given it to me as a present. I had read it before, as a child of about 12. What I remembered from this first reading of the book was less its account of Anne's life in hiding and her terrible death. I was, of course, aware of her destiny. But if I recall aright, it was for me like for most children. History, no matter if just 30 years ago or 300, was taking place in a faraway world that had nothing to do with my own. I doubt if I ever considered that Anne was actually younger than my own grandmother. And as you probably know, had she survived, she would have celebrated her 70th birthday last June. Why the diary meant a lot to me was so very typical that I identified with Anne's struggle for self-realization, a struggle that every adolescent wages in one or the other way. But she entered hers armed with unusual clarity about her goals and acute awareness of her gifts. In so many things she wrote, she spoke for me. I shared her curiosity and her love for life, and like her, I wanted finally, and most of all, be accepted by the adult world around me as one of them. When I picked up Anne's diary again, this time the so-called definitive edition, I actually had certain prejudices against it. I had seen a performance of the play in England when I was living there as an au pair in 1985. And to tell you the truth, I was not fond of it at all. I did not like the sentimentalized, idealized, and thus rather trivialized picture we were given of Anne Frank, of whom I knew that she had died so desperately in the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. I had become very interested in the history of the Second World War and the persecution of Jews from high school age on, but my interest certainly did not focus on Anne Frank. Instead, I had read many other books on the Shoah in the meantime, books like those of Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel, books that told me much more about the actual horror that people had to go through. But then, luckily, I did start reading Anne's diaries again. You notice I say diaries, because Anne left us not only one diary version, but rather two. I will explain you in a minute how that came. I have to tell you, I was quite surprised when I rediscovered the diary's values. I was caught by this girl and her extraordinary human and literary gifts, by her true and simple writing, her poetic writing indeed. I was quite surprised how differently Anne, in her own words, communicated with me, of how much she obviously knew about the concentration camps, about the murdering, even though naturally she was so much more involved in discovering herself than in political and war circumstances, even though the Holocaust in fact provided rather the context and the central theme of her diary. In autumn 1942, Anne Frank writes that Jews are not being brought to German labor camps, as they are made to believe, but rather deported to Poland. In spring of 44, in her second diary version, she says, "We assume that most of them are killed. The British broadcasting speaks about their being gassed." I mention this for two reasons. First, because Anne's story for many years has been largely de-Judaized. She gained reputation less as a Holocaust victim than as a spokesperson for so many other causes. And second, because the attitude of the German and Austrian population has been the object of an extended debate between historians ever since the war ended. And it is still unsolved. What could people know? The whole issue of knowledge of the Holocaust seems to have been so little discussed in Germany and especially in Austria that one figures some kind of collective repression was at work. We know that even though the population had no insight into the death camps like Auschwitz or Sobibor, it was impossible for them to overlook the deportations. We know that they could practice the art of looking away. They could easily ignore it, but they could certainly not overlook it. It's unfortunately true that many people in my country, the bystanders of the Nazis as we call them, failing to make a choice during a shameful period in which brutality, lies, opportunism and cowardice celebrated their triumph, until today refuse to admit what they knew? Or is it the underlying guilt for not having done more which paralyzes their memory? Excuse my sidestep, but this is one of the great values of Anne's diaries, that they, having been written during the time, rather than most of the books we get to read on the Holocaust, looking back on the tragedy with the entire knowledge of how it ended, confront us in an honest, by-the-way way, which is thus the more striking, with what people already during the war knew or should have known. The more I got involved, the more questions beset me that Anne's diaries, covering just 25 months of her life, naturally do not answer. What was her family background on either sides like? What was the environment in which she began to mature? What were the turning points of her childhood? Who were the people, the friends she loved, especially those she mentions in her diaries? Who, and that was a major question to me, was her mother, about whom we knew nothing until now, except for the nasty, sometimes even cruel remarks Anne made about her in her diaries? And what happened to Anne in her last 7 or 8 months of her life? Who was responsible for her being deported? Who did betray her? There was, strangely enough, no book that could answer my questions sufficiently, so I started my own research. But why did I think that all these questions regarding the details of Anne's life and that of her family and that of her friends were not only important to me, but also to everybody else interested in the diary? Why did I think that we needed a biography right at the end of the century that would help to keep Anne's memory alive and carry it into the 21st century? And most of all, how would this biography have to look like? After all, Anne Frank has already had so much publicity, more publicity than she could ever want. Anne already spoke to the public in the 1950s, long before the words Holocaust or Shoah became part of our vocabulary, and before where Auschwitz was and what it meant had become common knowledge. Actually, the term Holocaust first appeared in the New York Times in May 1959, 12 years after Anne's diary was first published, 7 years after it was first published in the US. Anne got the people's attention, though unfortunately more through the play than through her own words, when they were actually still far away from being ready to confront themselves with the crimes committed on the Jews. We know that the tremendous success of Anne's diary is mainly due to the play and the film based on the script of Goodrich and Hackett in the 1950s. Broadway and Hollywood made Anne Frank a star. Anne, the spirited, cheerful young girl with whom any audience should be able to identify. By universalizing her and separating the diary from its Holocaust context, as I earlier suggested, the scriptwriters could create a kind of happy, feel-good ending that has nothing to do with the real tragic end of Anne's life. During the half-century that has passed since the first publication of the diary, the ongoing publicity has transformed her into a legend, a symbol, a heroine, a myth, or however you want to call her. The name Anne Frank has become some kind of registered trademark even, and the way in which to market this trademark or not has been a disturbing discussion between the various Anne Frank organizations going on for years. Anne Frank was already world famous when this world's interest in the Holocaust awoke, and she became one of, if not the most wanted target of the Holocaust studies, a victim not only of the Nazis, but also of her interpreters, who commented and still find new ways to comment on every word she wrote, risking to rob her human identity. Hers was a strong personality. She was mature for her age, like most children who went through similar situations where she had a strong character, but it was still impressionable, still developing. Her biography, therefore, should not be and is not an attempt to probe the psychology and define the contours of a life lived to completion. It is instead an effort to follow Anne attentively on a personal and intellectual journey that was broken off so abruptly and prematurely, and look out for the hows and whys. I, on my part, found it important to put Anne's life back into the closest historical context possible. Only by combining general closely to personal history, Anne's life and the lives of the people around her, their hope that the Nazis would go this far and not any further can be understood by coming generations. And I felt it necessary to show that Anne's life was ordinary and typical, that she was, even though a very gifted writer to be and a strong character, most of all a normal girl struggling hard to find herself. That she was not the victim, but that she was one of millions of victims who perished. And I found it important to recite their names as well, instead of becoming fixated on Anne alone. In nearly every interview I did at a certain moment, we, the survivor I spoke to as well as I, got mixed feelings about the fact that it is always Anne who gets the attention, while they had to go through a similar horror, each individual of them. This, as you will see, influenced the making of the book greatly. Even if it is, of course, a biography of Anne Frank, it involves many other personal stories, and it contains an epilogue in biographies telling about what became of whom and how the survivors managed their lives after war. And with all these thoughts in my mind, I was in the middle of my research. My approach was, instead of looking for new interpretations based on the existing material, to act as an observer and, as I like to put it, gather as many fragments of the mosaic as possible and put them together in as authentic a picture of Anne's life and that of the people around her as possible. I did, of course, not intend to replace or interfere with her diary, but rather hope to supplement it. My search did not only lead me to several archives and lots of material never before published, but most importantly, to more than 20 people who knew Anne Frank personally and could contribute with thus far unknown details, facts, anecdotes to what made this life up. Most of them I visited more than just once, often many times, to check and recheck what they had told me, knowing that oral history is of great value, but with a celebrity like Anne Frank can be problematic. What do people really remember? What did they learn from the diary or other books? What from the media? Some of these people, survivors, had never been talking before, neither of Anne nor of their own lives, and again during our conversation got very insecure, asking, but who would be interested in these details? This, of course, comes from the experiences they made right after the war. Hardly anybody was interested in their stories. It is, of course, true that many survivors were unable to speak about what they went through or kept silent because they were trying, for various reasons, to forget and build up a new life, just as their perpetrators. Many of them, though, had an irrepressible need to bear witness. But there was no audience, no one to hear them. We are no longer at that point, and I have the feeling that the rather late attention the survivors get makes many of them, towards the end of their lives, worried about the aims of their current audience. The Holocaust has become central to modern consciousness, the husband of one of Anne's girlfriends once said to me. But what do people take out of it? It would unfortunately take too long to get into detail about my 3-year-long research story, but it was no doubt the most important and moving project of my life. Not everything, of course, went smoothly. I was quite surprised that Hans Westre, the director of the Anne Frank Foundation in Amsterdam, which also runs the famous Anne Frank House with about 700,000 visitors per year, refused to speak to me. I had written him a letter in which I explained what my goals were and that the last months of Anne's life were of special importance to me. I soon learned from the well-respected Dutch filmmaker Willy Lindwer what the reason was. He interviewed several women who had met Anne, Margot and Edith Frank in the camps without any cooperation of the Anne Frank House. The foundation argued that supplying this kind of information did not fit in with the image of Anne as preferred by the foundation. They would rather see Anne portrayed as a universal symbol of the desire for freedom. It should be there to give a sense of hope. Despite of everything, we still believe that people are good at heart. Anne, so the foundation argues, is not a historical victim of the Nazis per se. Her value should be that of a more general symbol of innocence and hope. This is a well-meant idea, but as you know, Anne wrote her last entry on August 1, 1944, 3 days before she was arrested. And this is, as we all agree, one of the reasons why the diary became such a bestseller, that we are not confronted with the actual horror. But the last months, I mentioned it before, of Anne's life, do in fact constitute the essence of her life history, which is that she was finally murdered, simply because she was Jewish. By pointing this out, I do of course not mean to deny that it is an important thing to warn the world, and especially young generations, of the danger of racism, fascism, and any kind of aggressive political or religious fundamentalism. But to deliberately ignore the last and final chapter in Anne's short life cannot contribute towards this well-meant struggle. There were two very important sources I had access to, without whom my book most probably would not be here, or if so, you would not have thought to invite me. Two sources why my book again and again has been called controversial. Two people who during the war had to make a choice between right or wrong, whose decency and self-sacrifice remain unforgettable. One is Miep Gies, the last still living of the helpers, who supplied the people in hiding with food, books, news from the outside world for about 25 months, day after day risking her life. Miep is 90 years old now. She lives in Amsterdam, is physically quiet, mentally totally healthy. It took months and months to finally win her confidence and make her speak about certain details she did not even touch in her own book, published in 1987. It was her who gave me the important hint of who the betrayer of the people in hiding could have been. She had always thought of a cleaning woman who used to work in the warehouse in front of the famous secret annex, but she had never talked about it. Miep's hint made me do my own research, dig into the records of two former police investigations of 1948 and 1963, both closed for lack of evidence, and speak to people who knew the person. Now I can say there is enough evidence that the cleaning woman Lena Hartog van Bladeren should have been brought to court. Let me point out at this moment to a general misinterpretation of the diary. It has been used, or rather misused, to create the image of the good Dutch, as if all Dutch were in resistance and hid Jews. The truth is that nowhere else in Western Europe the destruction of the Jews worked so well, due to the collaboration of a certain part of the Dutch population. Of about 140,000 Jews living in Holland in early 1942, 105,000 were dead by the end of the war. Of 20 to 30,000 Jews in hiding, we do not have an exact figure, 9,000 were found and deported. A large number of them were betrayed, among them the Frank family. This brings me to the second source why my book is called controversial and why it made it on the New York Times front page. I was very lucky to meet a man called Cor Sauk, who is now 75 years old. He's from Holland, and who has been working for the Anne Frank institutions for the last decades. And besides, he was a very close friend to Otto Frank, Anne's father. During the war, when he was about 18, 19 years old, he was involved in rescuing Jews. Close to the end of the war, he was arrested for carrying falsified papers for hidden Jews with him and brought to a Dutch concentration camp. Cor Sauk knows a lot to tell about Otto, but he was more interested in my research on Edith, Anne's mother. He shared my opinion that it was really a shame of how badly Edith was neglected by history up to now. The scientific diary edition, including a long introduction of about 100 pages, spends no more than 40 words on her. I reported Cor Sauk regularly about the successes and failures of my research, and he got very involved. It took nearly a year, though, until he called me up one day and asked me to come to Aachen in Germany. That is where he lives, and that is where Anne Frank's mother Edith was born and grew up. He said he had something very important to show me. And when I came, there on the table he had 3 sheets of paper. Thin, delicate office paper, like Anne used it to write her second diary version on. 2 blue and 1 pinkish. 3 pages out of Anne's diary that obviously nobody knew that they were existing, and with him. After the first excitement came the moment to ask myself if it was right to let the world know about these pages. Otto Frank had entrusted them to Core in 1980, about half a year before he died, because he did not want to have their content known as long as either he or his second wife, Otto Frank remarried in 1953, could be questioned about these pages. This condition fulfilled, Korsoik decided to let me see them and use them for my book. And the better I understood their content and the more I knew about their background, the clearer it became to me, yes, the world should know about them. The reason is that their content is very important to the diary. 2 of the pages are an alternative introduction to the B version of the diary. The 3 other pages, also taken from this B version, give an insight of the relationship between father, mother, and Anne Frank. This is the moment where I have to give you some background information on the diaries. As I said, and I try to be very brief, Anne wrote her diary twice. She started to write her diary on her 13th birthday in her famous red checkered autograph album. By the end of the year, this booklet was full, and Anne subsequently filled a number of notebooks with her diary letters. In March 1944, after a call over Radio Oranje from London by the Dutch State Secretary of Culture in Exile, Anne decided to rewrite her original diary entries. She wanted to use them as the basis of a novel she intended to publish after the war. In the few weeks from May to August 4, 1944, when she was arrested, she filled 324, or as we know today, 327 loose pages. She came to rework her diary until her entry of March 29, 1944. The critical or scientific edition, published in the US in 1989, compares her original version, which now is called the A version, to her second, the so-called B version, to the first version that Otto Frank ever published, called C version. This C version, that's the diary that we know, was mainly based on Anne's rewritten B version, which Otto took as Anne's final thoughts. And because this edited version is not really a diary, but an edited text, Otto called it, like Anne would have called her novel, the Annex or the Secret Annex. As I said, 2 pages of these so-called 5 missing pages are an alternative introduction to the B version of the diary. Anne states that nobody should ever lay hands on her diary entries. Otto Frank obviously took this remark literally and therefore was afraid he might be accused of having published Anne's writing against her wish. That's of course not true. With her intensive rewriting, Anne herself showed that she was thinking about publication. The other 3 withheld pages are far more striking. Anne tries to explain her mother's harshness as a result of a deep sadness. During a previous conversation with her father, Anne had learned that as a young man, he had not been allowed to marry the love of his life. Anne now understands that her mother turned to an embittered woman because her husband did not love her as passionately as she loved him. Of course, we argue that Anne, 15 years of age, romantic and locked up, had other dreams what love should be like. Of course, we know that at that time and in that social milieu, this kind of arranged marriage of convenience was perfectly normal. All this is true, and still this passage is of major importance to the diary, because whereas Anne in previous entries does not show any understanding and sympathy for her mother, in this entry, for the first time, she does. She is trying sincerely to do justice to her mother. By hiding away this passage, Otto Frank did injustice not only to his wife, but also to Anne, who shows that she was much more mature than we thought until now. I would like to point out to a myth that most people who studied the diary hang on to, and I did as well, until recently. Otto, when asked what changes he made in Anne's diary, kept saying that he had taken out some nasty remarks Anne had written about her mother Edith. The fact is that Anne herself had taken those remarks out. She did not copy them into her second diary version. And Otto Frank, for some peculiar reason, had put some of these remarks into the published C version. Well, the Anne Frank Fund in Basel, who holds the copyright of the diary, when informed about the pages, for some reason refused to let me publish them. That is why I could only paraphrase. The pages will finally be published, though. Next April, they will be included in a new critical edition prepared by the Dutch War Documentation Center in Amsterdam, and from there they will find their way in every diary edition published throughout the world. Doubleday's so-called definitive edition will then be even more definitive. This is the business side of the story, which is none of our business really. I would rather ask myself and you some more important questions. Which is the Anne Frank we need to remember? What are her messages? And in which way can she help us to remember the Holocaust? Anne Frank's diaries are still the most used books in schools when the Holocaust is taught. So I think this is an important question. There are Anne's personal messages that go to the youth of the world. I will focus just on one of them. Anne in the secret annex was confronted with a world in which the moral she was taught had lost its value, a world that was no longer a world but a trap. She had to live within intolerable barriers that did not permit her to be herself in the way she saw herself. She was chosen instead of getting an opportunity to choose for herself. Nevertheless, she fought, though often torn between optimism and pessimism, to keep her spirits high, to make something with her life, to work on herself. Anne Frank has become a symbol in the fight against intolerance. The real Anne Frank was much more skeptical than the one on stage, much more critical. She was uncomfortable to the others because she had an opinion, and she expressed it. We live in a world of conformism. It sometimes hides behind words like liberal or tolerant, but it means that everybody who has an opinion about something, who believes that one thing is more true than another, arouses suspicion. The fact that I have an opinion, that I choose a certain way to live, does not mean that I want to convince people near and far that my way is the only right way. An opinion, a conviction, does not make me intolerant. Actually, tolerance is rather weak and does not mean a lot if it is not based on a strong opinion. Liberalism should mean a respectful way to accept various opinions. And then there are Anne's more symbolical and historical messages. The Diary of Anne Frank has a most powerful role as the main gateway to the Holocaust. But having read or studied it, one has to enter that gate and turn to further studies on the persecution and destruction of Jews. The Anne Frank story deserves a context. Only thus Anne helps us to remember with horror and anger that ever prevents us from shutting the book on this history. Because this history is not a past, as I understood it as a child, it is part of our life. I'm trying to express that it is no use remembering the Holocaust alone. And I find it certainly of little use to remember the Holocaust as an incomprehensible, a unique massacre without equivalent in history. Despite its complete inhumanity, it was exercised by human beings with human motions. What made and makes Hitler unique, and I mean this in the worst meaning of the word, is less he as a person, but how much more successful he was in corrupting corruptible people than anyone else before him. That he proved to the world how little it takes to get ordinary people, too many of them, ready for barbaric evil action, how close good and evil lie together. People in Europe in 1945 were so naive to think, Now we can start anew from where we were in 1933. This is exactly what made the political scientist Alain Finkielkraut, certainly one of the most prominent of the new generation of French intellectuals, say the 20th century was a useless century. What he means is that we have drawn the wrong conclusions from Auschwitz. During the last decade, we have heard it again and again. Never forget, you have the duty to remember. We build Holocaust memorials, we visit the Anne Frank house on our holiday tour, but many of us tend to retire in some kind of ritual, collective remembering, ritual dismay. Hardly anybody is willing to set up any kind of relationship between these terrible crimes and himself. We say we, and we mean somebody else. Historians are to build bridges between the past and the present. They are to work on both shores. If our remembering is to make any sense for the future, it is the world after the Holocaust that we have to turn our attention to. It is not what would I have done had I lived in occupied Europe. This anyway is a question impossible to answer in honesty. No one who has not himself been led into temptation has the right to pass moral judgment on others, the historian Fritz Stern says. The question we are to ask ourselves is, what can I do to build a world in which Auschwitz is unthinkable? And this does not mean to universalize the Holocaust. I am far away from drawing superficial parallels between the Holocaust and today's atrocities. First, because this could normalize the Holocaust in a dangerous way. Second, because nations who did commit such atrocities would try to argue at least it was not as bad. But there is a good reason to instrumentalize the Holocaust. Never again in the world should such murdering based on an abstract theory be allowed to happen again. It seems there is no coming to terms with this part of our history. But, and you may call me naive if I now quote Pascal, the long procession of men over the course of the centuries must be considered as one same man who always survives and continues to learn. Or, as Anne Frank in her idealism would have put it, I still believe that people are able to learn. I thank you very much, and any questions you have, I will try to answer.
Host, open it up. In the course of your research, I'm curious what, if any, aspect, not so much of Anne Frank's life, not the incidents and the details, but of her personality, did you find unexpected and surprising?
Points of her character that would surprise me. Well, I was speaking to many people who knew the not famous Anne Frank, Anne Frank, that was one of them. And that wasn't really surprising that there were also people who didn't like Anne Frank. Still, it was surprising to hear that schoolmates who were in class with her would describe her as a very difficult, very jealous little girl who always wanted to be the center of attention, who could get very angry if things didn't happen her way, who could get very jealous when her so-called best girlfriend would dare to speak with somebody else. As I said, that was not really surprising because I was looking for the human being Anne Frank with all her good and her bad sides. But it meant, of course, especially as she was such an extremely extroverted girl who hated to be alone. One of her best girlfriends told me that every day she would say, come on, stay with me overnight. Let's, I don't know, read during the night or have fun. She just couldn't very well be by herself in the time before hiding. I could imagine how extremely difficult it must have been for her to go into hiding, and we get this knowledge from her diary entries, partly at least. But for her, it was much more difficult than, for example, for her sister Margot, who was a very quiet person. And the more respect, of course, I have for how she managed to get, to find herself in these circumstances that were so extremely difficult for her.
Other comments, questions?
Thank you for sharing your insights on the Holocaust and some of your research findings. I'm interested in what you learned of how Anne Frank perceived her own end, how she perceived her imprisonment and her ultimate death.
We do not know very much about it, of course, but I spoke to two women who met her in Bergen-Belsen. One story is quite well known. It's a story of Hanna Goslar, her childhood friend, who was in a different part of the camp in Bergen-Belsen and spoke to her through a fence. She couldn't see her because there was straw in this fence, so she just heard her voice and heard her saying how desperate she was, that she had thought that she has lost her parents already. Anne had to think, of course, when she when she was departed from her then father in the mid-50s at the ramp in Auschwitz, that he was immediately gassed. So she thought she had lost her beloved father, and that obviously took away a lot of her power and her strength to live on. So at that time, when that must have been about January, February 1945, Anne Frank was not at all anymore the girl that we usually think of when we talk about her, the high-spirited, optimistic girl, but she was a broken girl, a very sick girl who had lost her hope for a good end. The same I heard from another classmate of hers who spent quite some time with her in Bergen-Belsen. Actually, she's mentioned in the diary as well as a classmate, and Anne speaks very negatively about her. They didn't like each other at school at all. Her name is Nanette Blitz, and she lives in Brazil today, in Sao Paulo. And she also experienced a completely broken girl, completely desperate girl, unfortunately, who obviously did not believe anymore that all people were good at heart, but saw it much more skeptical at that time. What she did hope, though, was that if she survived and if she got out of the concentration camp, to write a novel. She was mentioning that to Nanette Blitz in the camp, and Nanette Blitz remembers that so well because right after war she was writing that in letters to other survivors. She was telling the story of Anne, whom she had met in the camp already in 1945 to somebody. And as I said before, I'm very careful with oral history and of what people really remember or what they think they remember. But I did find letters from immediately after the war where these things are written, so I can be sure that they were true. That's why it was so important for me to write that last chapter of Anne's life as well. Not to destroy her image, but to finalize her story. Yes, please.
Would you call Anne Frank a hero? And I go around and give speeches on heroes and heroism, and young people in high school sometimes ask me, is Anne Frank a heroine? How would you answer that question?
Well, actually I'm trying always to stress that she was most of all a normal, an ordinary girl. But in many ways she is a hero for me, as a small everyday hero in the way how she coped with her own life in the hiding place. And as I said before, it was not at all easy for her to be squeezed together with 7 adults who didn't take her seriously, who were making fun about her, writing her diary, who thought, that's child stuff, who didn't accept her really as one of them. That's what Otto Frank, the father after the war, admitted that only after he had read Anne's diary, he understood how deep her thoughts really were and how mature she was. But in the hiding place, she was always the girl, the child. And I think in the way she handled her situation in the hiding place, how she was studying and working on herself and being critical with herself, she really lived up as an example, I think you say in English. She is an example also for today's world in this very private field, in this how she worked on herself and how she developed in this during that time.
Any other questions or comments? If not, let me thank you for being so generous with your time and your reflections. I think I speak for everyone in wishing you the best of success with a new edition of the book and with your future research.
Thank you.
Anyone who would like to look at the book or get a copy signed, now is the time. We'll just move this away and make it more comfortable.
Melissa Muller is a journalist who lives in Munich and Vienna. Her book, Anne Frank, The Biography, was recently released in paperback by Owl Books, a division of Henry Holt & Company. For more information, click onto their website at hholt.com. You can find Biography on Book TV 3 times every Sunday at noon.
Of our century, a patron saint of liberalism. And although her diary has not only become the most widely read book written by a Holocaust victim, but one of the most widely read books ever, sold in around 30 million copies in over 55 languages. Let me tell you what I, as a third after-war generation, coming from Austria of all places, wanted to achieve with this book. Let me give you some insight in my sources, and finally, let me try to add something to the discussion to what the girl and her diaries have to tell, or to my mind should tell, to today's world and to future generations. I was about 26 years old when, by mere chance, I picked up Anne's diary again. Actually, a friend had given it to me as a present. I had read it before, as a child of about 12. What I remembered from this first reading of the book was less its account of Anne's life in hiding and her terrible death. I was, of course, aware of her destiny. But if I recall aright, it was for me like for most children. History, no matter if just 30 years ago or 300, was taking place.
To have achieved the status of classic. And curiously, its reputation and its readership, as those of us who stock the book here at the Coop can attest, continues to grow all the time. But I think universality comes at a price. And the problem may be that with every passing year, it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to discern Anne the girl beneath Anne the icon, or Anne the person beneath Anne the personification. And so we have tonight's special guest, Melissa Muller, coming to us direct from Vienna, to thank for saving Anne Frank from the rigidities of universality and revivifying the icon, so to speak, so we can appreciate Anne and the immediacy of her life and in history. Last year, Anne Frank, the biography, which surprisingly is the only full biography of Anne Frank ever to have appeared, was published to great acclaim in hardback here in English edition. I understand it's been published in at least 4 or 5 languages, and the paperback has just arrived. And to tell us more about the background of the book and
in a faraway world that had nothing to do with my own. I doubt if I ever considered that Anne was actually younger than my own grandmother. And as you probably know, had she survived, she would have celebrated her 70th birthday last June. Why the diary meant a lot to me was so very typical that I identified with Anne's struggle for self-realization, a struggle that every adolescent wages in one or the other way. But she entered hers armed with unusual clarity about her goals and acute awareness of her gifts. In so many things she wrote, she spoke for me. I shared her curiosity and her love for life, and like her, I wanted finally, and most of all, be accepted by the adult world around me as one of them. When I picked up Anne's diary again, this time the so-called definitive edition, I actually had certain prejudices against it. I had seen a performance of the play in England when I was living there as an au pair in 1985. And to tell you the truth, I was not fond of it at all. I did not like this sentimentalized, idealized, and thus rather trivialized picture we were given of Anne Frank, of whom I knew that she had died so desperately in the concentration camp of Bergen.
And how she wrote it, we're happy to present Melissa Muller, who will afterwards answer your questions. We'll have a general discussion. And as is our custom, those of you who would like to have a copy, either hardback or paperback, can come up and Melissa will sign it for you at the end of the session. With that, it's my great pleasure to present Melissa Muller.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you tonight. And I'm here to give you details on how I came and why I wrote a biography on Anne Frank. Or actually, it was a long discussion within the publisher whether we should be so indecent to call it the biography. But as there was really no biography on Anne Frank before, we thought we could take the risk. Even though, as we just heard, she has not only become Hitler's most famous victim, but also one of the most famous females of the 20th century, only recently voted by Time magazine as one of the most influential heroes.
Next, Biography on Book TV with Melissa Muller discussing her work, Anne Frank, the Biography. It traces the brief life of the Holocaust victim and has attracted attention for its claim to have solved a mystery surrounding the person who betrayed Anne and her family to the Nazis. Ms. Mueller's remarks took place at the Harvard Co-op bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Good evening and welcome back to the Coop, those of you who have been here before, and welcome, period, for those of you who are here for the first time. It is reported that when Abraham Lincoln first met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote, of course, Uncle Tom's Cabin, he said, so this is the little lady who made the big war. I think that if a latter-day Abraham Lincoln, by some miracle, could meet a resurrected Anne Frank, he might say something like, so this is the little girl who gave a human face to the big war. Certainly, Anne Frank's diary is the only personal, intimate document from the Second World War